I never thought I'd see death in such a way. The first thing that hit me wasn't the blood. The blood was expected. It was how it seeped, slow and deliberate, into the dark mahogany of the desk. Like time itself was being sucked away, drop by drop. I'd seen murder scenes before, crimson stains on cracked tile, bodies contorted in unnatural positions. But this was different. It felt cold, preordained. James Hamilton, the local businessman everyone had an opinion about, sat lifeless, slumped against his desk. His eyes were wide open, frozen in that final moment of shock, a smear of whiskey staining the corner of his lips. The air smelled metallic, bitter, like the world had turned upside down in a single breath. The blood on the floor wasn't the only thing soaking in that room. Something else was. Something sinister, lurking beneath the surface. I hadn't known him personally, but people always talked. He was a genius to some, a shark to others, and there were rumors that swirled like cigarette smoke in a bar. James was a man of secrets, but even with all his power, no one had predicted this. No one knew how deep the lies ran, or how many people would fall for them. That night, I wasn't supposed to be there. I was in the middle of another case when I got the call. Not from the police, but from my old contact at the local newspaper. They needed someone to look deeper, someone with a nose for the truth buried beneath layers of deception. And I, Eleanor Grant, wasn't about to pass up the opportunity. Something about this case didn't sit right. I could feel it crawling under my skin before I even stepped foot into his office. It wasn't just a murder. It was something darker, something twisted. I remember walking into that office like it was a funeral parlor, the chill in the air wrapping around me like a cold hand. And there she was, Rachel Lawson, sitting in the corner, her hands trembling. Blood stained her fingers. Her eyes were wide open but unseeing, staring past me, past the room, past everything. She wasn't talking. She didn't even blink. The officers had already taken her in, yet there she was, her silence louder than any scream. I wanted to talk to her, to make sense of what happened, but I could tell it was no use. The doctors would later say she was in shock, so overwhelmed by the trauma that it had left her mute, but I wasn't buying it. Not completely. Something wasn't right. Something about Rachel screamed that there was more buried beneath her silence than any doctor could diagnose. And I, for one, was determined to uncover it. I'm not the type to back down, especially when it comes to a case that feels personal. I'm an investigative journalist, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence is often more telling than words. Rachel's silence gnawed at me. She wasn't just a witness. She was hiding something. I could feel it. Every fiber of my being told me there was more to her than what the others saw. People had whispered about her and James. She was his secretary for years. Close. Too close. Some said it was an affair, others that it was just business. But those were just surface-level speculations. I needed to dig deeper. I needed to know who Rachel really was. What I found shook me. Rachel hadn't just been James's secretary. She had a past that was messy, full of shadows and lies. She'd been married before, but that marriage had ended in disgrace. The scandal. Embezzlement. She had been accused of siphoning money from her ex-husband's business. The whispers had been loud then, but once she vanished from the social scene, people forgot, or chose to. What I found didn't sit well with me. A woman with a history like that could have a dark side. But this felt like something more. It felt like the walls were closing in, and the more I learned, the tighter the grip around my throat became. The puzzle pieces started to fit, but I couldn't shake the question. Was she involved in James's death? Then came the chilling part. James had hired a private investigator just days before his death. David Trent was his name, and he'd been digging into the company's financial records, searching for fraud, hidden dealings. It wasn't just a few questionable transactions. James had stumbled onto something far worse. something that could ruin lives. But Rachel, she had been involved. She knew. She'd been working alongside him, tracking down the hidden transactions, attending those late-night meetings. It wasn't just business. It was something darker. She knew more than she was letting on. And now, I was getting closer to the truth. Too close. I found discrepancies in Rachel's own financial records. Small amounts of money, odd deposits, irregular withdrawals. Nothing big enough to raise a red flag on its own, but enough to make me stop and look closer. Rachel wasn't the victim she appeared to be. She wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had her hands dirty, and no one had noticed. No one except me. I tracked down David Trent, the private investigator, after a lot of persuasion. I needed him to fill in the blanks. We met in a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where secrets were exchanged over weak coffee, the kind of place where you could hear the lies thick in the air. David wasn't an easy man to read, but when he spoke, I listened. He filled in the missing pieces. James had hired him to investigate employees he suspected of skimming money. But it wasn't just any group of employees. These were the people James trusted. People who had been with him for years. They knew his weaknesses. They knew exactly how far they could push him before he'd snap. But what David didn't know, what none of us knew, was just how deep the betrayal went. The recording changed everything. James had left a voicemail just a few days before his death. It wasn't much, just a phone call to someone he trusted. But Rachel had overheard it. She had been there, close enough to hear everything. She knew what James had planned. He was going to expose the fraud, the criminal activity within his company. He was going to tear everything down. But Rachel had been terrified. Terrified of what would happen if the truth came out. Terrified of losing everything she'd worked for. That night, when the criminals broke in, when the violence escalated beyond control, Rachel had been there. She had witnessed it all. But she didn't stop it. She couldn't. She wasn't the murderer, but she might as well have been. She had been part of the deception, part of the betrayal. And when it all fell apart, she was left with blood on her hands. Literally. Her silence wasn't just shock. It was protection. Protection from herself, from the life she had built, from the lies she had told. But just when I thought I had it all figured out, something else came to light. Something darker. Rachel wasn't just hiding her involvement in James's death. She was hiding something far more dangerous. Something that could tear the entire town apart. I thought I had uncovered the truth. But the truth is a cruel thing. It leaves you broken, alone. And as I walked out of that room, I realized something. The truth was no longer just a story I was chasing. It was a story I had become part of. And now, I wasn't sure if I could escape it.